I turn now to think about the poem's moral. I like McCusick's argument, and I like what he says about language. I think it's really interesting. But I think there's a real danger of trying to reduce this poem to a straightforward moral message. And that's perhaps a besetting sin of what we do in literary criticism. It's very easy to try and boil down a novel or a poem or any other text to, don't do this, don't do that, whatever. And in fact, often that's the least interesting thing about a text. What's interesting about texts is their complexities and ambivalences, and the fact that they may not be consistent or coherent in terms of the sorts of messages they produce. And in fact, thinking about a text in terms of a message may be the wrong way of thinking about it. Being aware of the complexity and, as it were, the broadness of a text and the sort of diversity of a text may be a better and more helpful critical tool. But nonetheless, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner does invite us to think about its moral, at least because it presents a moral at the end, as you'll see on the slide. He prayeth well who loveth well, both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small. This all sounds very nice, but Coleridge himself was troubled by this moral, and a number of readers of the poem, both contemporary readers during the late 18th century and also modern readers, have found a lack of fit between those very pleasant sentiments and the nightmarish universe that the poem represents. After all, this is a poem in which the mariner's act, however gratuitous and however evil, leads to what seem to be highly excessive consequences, including the deaths of his crew members. Now, you could argue that the crew members are complicit in the act because they sort of think, well, it was justified if it allowed the ship to escape and to move on from the ice floe. But nonetheless, they're hardly, instigators, and yet they all die, and in fact only the mariner survives. So it does seem to be the consequences of sinning or transgressing seem to be vastly in excess of the actual sin or transgression itself. Furthermore, what happens to the crew depends ultimately on a game of chance between the skeletal figures of Death and his consort, who in a later version of the poem Coleridge would call Life in Death. So it's hard to argue that the fate of the mariner or his crew is in any way morally coherent or just. It's hardly the sign of a loving God. This is a universe in which life is cheap and violence is endemic. People and other entities will, it seems, commit illogical and malicious acts. Mariners will shoot albatrosses without any particularly good reason. So there's a sort of mismatch perhaps between the moralising ending of the poem and what happens throughout most of it. We also, I think, need to be careful not to confuse being natural, whatever that means, with being nice. And I think often ecological writing and eco-criticism does tend to conflate the two, and yet in fact they might be very different things. Now, quite what leads the mariner to shoot the albatross is never really explained. In the Christian reading of the poem, you might see it as a symbol of original sin, the fact that all human beings are born into the world sinful and only can be redeemed through the love of Jesus Christ. And so the mariner's act shows the human capacity to be sinful. A more secular reading would be to think of it in terms of what Edgar Allan Poe called the imp of the perverse. In a very disturbing story about a cat, the narrator, Poe's narrator, talks about how much he loved the cat and how much the cat loved him, and how he just decided to kill the cat out of pure malice, but without any particular sort of reason for it. An example of the imp of the perverse might be, if you remember the controversy quite recently about the woman who put a cat in a wheelie bin with the CCTV. Now, one way of reading that would be that was a sort of very disturbed and strange woman who did that. Another way might be to think, well, perhaps most people are capable of doing gratuitous acts just on a whim sometimes without any real explanation, and committing violence and harming others without necessarily having very good reasons for it. And that would be an example of what Poe thinks of as the imp of the perverse. By perverse, he doesn't mean sort of sexually perverse. He means the way of doing something that's not necessarily in anyone's best interests, doing something that sort of goes against the grain of what's moral or what's logical or what's reasonable. If you like, the human impulse to make a mess of things might be an example of the imp of the perverse. So there are different ways of reading the mariner's apparently gratuitous act of shooting the albatross. It's very easy to agree in theory with a moral like the moral at the end of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but as you may know, and as Coleridge certainly knew, it's very hard to live by those sort of abstract morals. And perhaps the main difficulty that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner addresses is a difficulty of how we deal with creatures or other people or entities that seem different from us. How do we deal with otherness? And the way in which human beings deal with animals might be a good example of that, the difficulty of encountering the other. As readers, we of course have an encounter with the other, the strangeness of the universe of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the strangeness of the poem's language. And much as McCusick tries to argue that the language is sort of diverse and inclusive and rather sort of nice in an ecological way, it might actually be something quite resistant to us and quite difficult for us to engage with. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the difficulties that we might have in engaging with the poem's language might be mirrored in some ways in the way in which the poem finds its own morality problematic. And in both cases there's an encounter with what's strange or what's different or what's other. I'm going to go on now in the final and rather long section of the podcast to talk about hospitality and violence. I'm going to think a little more about the central event of the poem, the shooting of the albatross, and what that means. When he republished the Rime of the Ancient Mariner in 1817, Coleridge added a set of marginal comments that were presented as helping the reader to make sense of the poem. You could argue that it was this marginal gloss was a way of trying to make this rather weird and incoherent text more comprehensible. It was Coleridge was offering a sort of interpretation of his own poem to his readers, and in a way that might be seen as trying to make the poem safer in some ways. To the stanza describing the way in which the mariner shoots the albatross, this action that's never really explained, Coleridge added, "The ancient mariner inhospitably killeth the pious bird of good omen." This has always struck me as a rather odd sentence, and I think it's the word inhospitably. We might think of being inhospitable as quite a minor crime. So, if you go around someone's house and they don't give you a cup of tea, that's inhospitable. If you go around someone's house and they shoot you with a crossbow, that's murderous. But yet, inhospitable is actually quite a powerful word there, because if we think about it, hospitality is a really important aspect of how societies function. After all, hospitality is how we deal with strangers, with the foreign, with people we're unfamiliar with. A failure of hospitality is a failure to acknowledge the needs of others, and perhaps particularly the needs of strangers. The notion that we should acknowledge such needs might be seen as one of the sort of basic tenets of a civilised society. That's a debatable point, but I think it's one that we might be able to agree with. Hospitality, of course, is very difficult, and we only need to think about the various controversies surrounding the treatment of asylum seekers to realise how difficult it can be. For the philosopher Jacques Derrida, and there he is on the slide, hospitality is a very troubled, perhaps even an inherently impossible form of interaction. Derrida argues that hospitality is made possible by the power of the host, and yet also demands that the host lets go of their power. It is meant to be about relinquishing control by inviting someone into your home, and yet it demands certain forms of control, that they're allowed as your guests under certain restrictions and rules. So, for Derrida, and Derrida is a very paradoxical thinker and a very difficult thinker, hospitality is inherently entirely paradoxical. We don't have to go that far to agree that there are tensions in the notion of hospitality, because it involves quite complex power relations between the host and the guest. Hospitality always involves a form of transgression. We think of transgression now as meaning a sort of crime or a sin, a sort of disobedience of rules. Its literal meaning is the crossing of boundaries. So, literally, a guest crosses into the home and allows this encounter with the foreign or with the other. And of course, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is very interested in the crossing of boundaries. I'll just quote the lines on the slide. "At length did cross an albatross, through the fog it came, and an it were a Christian soul, we held it in God's name. The mariners gave it biscuit worms, and round it flew. The ice is split with a thunder fit, the helmsman steered us through. And the good south wind sprang up behind, the albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. The albatross comes from outside, crossing the fog and the ice that trapped the ship. The sailors treat it as a human guest, as a Christian soul, while of course being at the same time that it isn't aware that it isn't quite that. The Mariner's Act is another crossing of a boundary, exemplified of course by the word crossbow. It's an act that turns the albatross back from a Christian soul, which is how it had been imagined as a guest, into an animal whose existence isn't conceived as important. In that sense, it is inhospitable because it treats the albatross as an enemy, whereas previously the albatross has been treated by the sailors as a friend. But this shooting could also reflect the potential violence that Derrida identifies at the heart of hospitality. For a guest, by definition, encroaches on the home and is meant to be welcomed, yet this encroachment, perhaps even this invasion, always has the potential to be seen as hostile, as challenging the host's authority. And perhaps actually the fact that the albatross seems to have allowed the ice to split, and therefore allowed the ship to move on, to escape, tends to position it in a place of authority over its hosts, over the human crew. It makes the albatross the arbiter of whether they escape from this terrible trap that they're in. So in a perverse way, the Mariner's Act might be seen as an attempt to repair this imbalance of power by asserting the human power over the natural world. As I've said, one of the most fascinating things about this poem is the fact that the mariner's action is never really explained. And it could be original sin, it could be the imp of the perverse, it could be whatever. But I've been reading it in terms of hospitality and power. But I wonder if this issue of power could also be read ecologically. The interconnection of organisms, which of course is what ecology is interested in, does not often involve the sharing of food, or acts such as the mariner's blessing of the water snakes. And the way in which Mariner blessed the water snakes, I bless them unawares, is seen as a sort of defining moment in the poem, the beginning of the mariner's redemption. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. And that's certainly one way in which the mariner interacts with the natural world. But it may not be the only way, and it may actually be a rather morally idealised way of human-animal interaction. I've been thinking about this violence in terms of hospitality and the difficult power relationships that hospitality evokes. But I wonder if this violence can also be seen, perhaps in relation to that, in connection to the environment. The mariner's blessing of the water snakes is seen as a sort of key moment in the poem, the moment when the mariner stops being alienated from the natural world and is able to connect up. And perhaps the water snakes are the same as the slimy things that he's so disgusted by earlier. So it's not that they've changed, it's just that he sees the world, he sees his environment in a different way. And as a result of that, his redemption, his partial redemption begins. And I think that's fine. But we shouldn't see that sort of blessing as the only possible way in which organisms can interact with each other. After all, as Tennyson wrote, the natural world is red in tooth and claw. That the sharing of food or blessing or nurture are only one aspect of the way in which natural beings interact with each other. One of the principal forms of organic connection, after all, is violence.